So, welcome everybody for another episode of Views from the Field. We're moving from silence in our opening meditation, which was guided by our guest teacher, Michael Waupoose. Michael, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
You are.
okay, great. Yeah, and we're joined here with a small consortium of teachers on our Sunday Zoom session due to the fact that we had some computer changes and glitches getting people into the session. But we're happy to have those that are here. These sessions are supported by our community. And if you're inspired by them in any way, excuse me, and you'd consider making a donation, there'll be a link below in the video description. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Waupoose, who is a friend and colleague I've had the pleasure of knowing within our work in MBSR, and I deeply respect Michael's teaching, a very knowledgeable and experienced teacher. So welcome again, Michael. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. I feel very fortunate to be joining you all.
Thank you. Our pleasure. So as a way of introduction, you're a licensed clinical social worker and a certified MBSR teacher, and you're teaching at the University of Wisconsin Health Mindfulness Program. You're offering classes for adults and the BIPOC community, and also train teachers by holding MBSR teacher training intensives. And this is a place I would like to explore a little bit right at the beginning. The fact that you're an enrolled member of the Menominee, and am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. Menominee.
Menominee Indian tribe of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And you're offering mindfulness classes on the Menominee Indian Reservation. So we like to begin these sessions with what I consider and call an origin story. And I'm wondering how having these tribal roots, plays into your origin in becoming an MBSR teacher.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I remember the very first time that I was led in mindfulness-ish practice. I was at a social work conference, and Marsha Linehan was the keynote speaker, and she does a lot of work with people with bipolar disorder and has developed an intervention that is really, really deeply grounded in mindfulness. And so she led some practices, and I remember very distinctly feeling in my body like something was resonating about that, like something really that felt like wordless, like I couldn't put words to it. And I remember thinking to myself, I think there's something here for me. Personally, not like way beyond, not even thinking about work-wise, but just really feeling like I think there's something here for me. And what I've come to realize over time is that I think that is like deeply rooted in my ancestral teachings around the relationship, my relationship to everything around me, my relationship to my body, my relationship to the earth, my relationship to the other beings around me. I have this deeply, firmly held belief that that ancestral wisdom is passed down through us, and so I feel like that's what sort of like that's what got sort of strummed or tickled a little bit in those brief, really brief offerings that Marsha gave. And I remember thinking to myself, I need to look into this. So like I need to look into this mindfulness stuff and see if I can learn more about it. So I feel like that's where like what really, sort of like when two things come together in just the right way, right? Something sort of blossoms from that. And I feel like that's what happened in that moment. Yeah, I like it was such a strong experience, like that has just stayed with me for many years now. that first sort of introduction to close your eyes, feel your breath, feel your body, right? There was something about that awakened those ancient teachings in me.
Yeah. So that wonderful. That something about it was, and we do this often in MBSR.
Mhm.
Was it felt viscerally in the body? Was it emotional?
Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely visceral in my body, right? Like I could feel my body waking. I could feel my body, my awareness of my body waking up, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
remember like feeling like moved, right? Like I could feel
Yeah.
emotions being stirred up around all of that. And I think that that's what really, really um, made me think I need to check this out. Like I need to understand this more because I think
Yeah.
there's something here for me, right? I'm a person in recovery from a substance use disorder, um, and at that time I probably had been clean. I bet probably 20 years. And it was sort of that same kind of awakening. It's like, oh, there's something here that sort of will deepen my understanding of myself and my relationship to this world, right? And I didn't have the words then, but the words that I have now are this awareness of the relief of suffering, right? Like I didn't have those words then, but I know now that that was like that. Oh, there's something relieving here, right? There's something letting go and loosening a little bit here. And today, as a result of practice and teaching and training and more practice, I've come to realize it was like that awakening to the potential for the relief of suffering. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And now you're coming full circle, bringing it back.
Yeah.
And what are you discovering as you teach on the
Um,
reservation?
I think probably one of the biggest discoveries that I'm having about myself is all of the ways that colonization shows up in the way that I think, the way that I behave, the way that I act, how tightly I hold to some things. Like how firmly I can grip onto an agenda at the cost of actually paying attention to what's really happening, right?
Yeah.
Um, holding on to the tightness of here's how here's how it needs to go, and
Yeah.
here's how it needs to happen, and not having room for the sort of the organic experience of an MBSR class to emerge, right? And finding the ways that I actually um, infringe on that or dampen that or constrain it. Um, so that's been a really, really big teaching for myself. Um, I think the other thing has been like really having to rethink how MBSR or mindfulness meditation is brought into communities, into my community. Um, I had a really, really specific idea of I'm going to offer an intro session, and I'm going to offer a community session, and then I'm going to do this, and then of course there's going to be swarms of people who want to come, right? Well, it has not gone like that at all. And so what has happened is that I've learned how to develop a long view and how to see, the community is now starting to reach out to me to say, we heard that you've taught X, Y, and Z. We have this event coming up, and we're wondering if you would be open to coming and doing a presentation, right? Realizing like that's the way that the foot gets into the door, right? That's the way that's the invitation to come home back to the community, right? Um, And so it's been an interesting shift in sort of the funding that we have to do this, to reevaluate what that looks like, how I'm doing it, what's realistic and what's not realistic, right? Like it may not be realistic over a 4-year span to train teachers. It may be more realistic to actually watch it naturally emerge over a 10-year span, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's been, that's been another really, I think, important teaching for me. I think the other thing is, so I was born on my reservation, but I was raised off reservation. And my parents moved us off the reservation when I was about 3 years old, and then we would go back regularly. So we maintained a consistent relationship with the reservation and the tribe. And I would live with my grandparents during the summer until I was probably about 14 or 15 years old. And so this interesting relationship of, in some respects, being seen as an outsider because of not having been raised on the reservation, and also having an incredibly well-known name and a really established family history on the reservation. So watching how those two things come together, and just being like walking respectfully and quietly, right? You know how sometimes as a new teacher, certainly for me, I know as a new teacher, I got out my drum and I was beating it hard and loud. And so I'm watching how that has shifted as well, right? There's a softening around how to teach on the reservation. And so, so like finding myself saying, you know what, these 5 people who are in the class right now, who are meditating, who are practicing, like that's enough right now. This is enough. These are 5 people who are having some insights into their suffering and the relief of their suffering. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it kind of leads me into the next question. I was wondering if you had been born there and that relationship in your childhood to those roots and how they might have influenced your coming to MBSR. So where does MBSR move in?
Yeah. So after I had that experience at that conference, I came back to Madison and was absolutely flabbergasted to learn that Madison is sort of like this hotbed of meditation. Like the Dalai Lama comes here, Richie Davidson is here, the Center for Healthy Minds is here. There's a number of sitting groups here. One of them invites nationally known teachers to come offer residential and non-residential retreats every summer. Like I was like, holy smokes, like who knew all this was going on, right? And that we had the UW Health Mindfulness Program that at that time was being run by Catherine Bonus, who trained with John Kabat-Zinn. And John came out here and did a research study that Catherine and he taught in together. He had come out here for a number of events for the mindfulness program to help to raise money for the mindfulness program. And so I took an MBSR class. I actually took it because I was getting feedback in my job that I was a bit of a jerk, that I was rigid, I was controlling, I was really tight, I was really demanding, I was harsh. And what really, really surprised me was that I felt like that the insides of me were so different than that. Like I felt like inside I was this nice and kind and gentle and tender person, but something was happening in the translation. Like what was coming out just wasn't matching what felt like the insides. Mm-hmm. And I remember like feeling deeply hurt by that feedback. And so I took the MBSR class because I thought it could help me to learn how to be a nicer person. And that's why I went. And I remember the teacher saying, so why are you here? What are your goals? What do you want to achieve? And I told all of that. And then she asked us to put that aside and simply commit ourselves to the practice and see what happens by not trying to make something happen. And she said, at the end of the 8 weeks, we'll check back in. And at the end of the 8 weeks, she said, so now like pull out that sheet where you wrote down what you wanted to get out of here. And now what did you get? And I remember having this deep awareness that what happened was that I became much kinder with myself, that I was less harsh with myself. I was less critical. I was less rigid and demanding of myself. Like I just become kinder to myself. And that really, really shocked me. But what really surprised me was about 6 months later, I continued a meditation practice. I've continued a meditation practice since that first MBSR class. But about 6 months later, a woman that I supervised came up to me one day in supervision. She said, "I'm not sure what you've been doing, but please keep doing it." And that's when it was like, oh, something like there's something else happening here, right? Which that really, really shocked me. And it really had a significant impact on me, that awareness that something inside was happening, but also that something somehow that was getting translated in some kind of way. Um, and so, so I continued to meditate. I started going on retreat, short retreats, long retreats. I remember getting ready to go on one of my first long retreats, and my husband said, "So like, what's going to happen while you're there?" So I said, and I've been on some short ones, and I said, "Well, so this is typically what happens. You do this, and then this, and this, and all." And he says, can I just ask you one favor? And I said, "Sure." He goes, "If they serve Kool-Aid, please don't drink it." I said, "I promise." Yeah, and so I see these little things pop up in my life that remind me that that meditation, that these practices and these teachings have transformed my life in ways that that I did not make happen, that I didn't do, that I didn't like have this goal for this, right? Like little small things will come up. I remember I was telling Allan and Mark earlier that three of my grown nephews are here visiting, and they used to come visit us when they were really small, from the time that they were 9-10 months old. They would come for long weekends, sometimes for a week, to stay with us. And I remember the middle one time was visiting, and I'd been meditating for some period of time, and he and I were doing the dishes after supper. And he said, "Uncle Mike," he said, whenever we come to see you, we do a lot of things. We do things together." And I said, "Yeah, we do." And he looks me dead in the eye and he says, "I think you like to make memories." But what I realized was that what he was noticing was my presence. That when he and I, like, we never did like big elaborate things. Like it might be like, I don't know, weeding the garden, or cooking a meal together, or doing the dishes together, or going for a walk together. So they were never any elaborate kinds of things. But I think that what he saw was this quality of presence that was showing up in my life, this ability to sort of be with him when I was with him. I remember being a young child, when I would go to live with my grandparents during the summer. I have this really distinct memory all the time of sitting with my grandmother and having no doubt in my mind that in those moments there was nothing more important to her than me, right? And that was that quality of presence, the way that she was just with me, undistracted, right? Not trying to fill the time with anything. And I think that that's what sort of meditation and MBSR has sort of introduced me to, was this ability to simply be present with things as they are unfolding. Right. And I think that what has, so I now have these, nearly adult, like 22, 19, and 17-year-olds who used to come stay with me when they were 10 months old, who still want to come stay with me. Right. Like they said, a few months ago, they said, "Uncle Mike, can we come for a weekend?" I was flabbergasted. Right. Like that just seems odd, not odd, but it was a deep, sweet surprise. And I think that it's from that. It's from those moments of being present and allowing to be born out of that, this quality of you are deeply loved and cared for right now. There's nothing more important than you here right now. Right? Yeah. They were looking for some board games for us to play last night, and I still have some of the books that I would read them at bedtime. And it was I like made my heart burst wide open that they grabbed their favorite book and asked if I would read it to them one more time. So here's this 19-year-old and 17-year-old and 22-year-old sitting on the bed together, and I'm reading this pop-up book about dinosaurs. So I think that those are the things that one that like I think that MBSR gave me, right? It introduced me to these, but it's also those things that sustain me, right? It's those things that sustain my practice. Like when I feel myself flailing, or when I feel my my motivation or my dedication or my commitment starting to get wobbly, right? Like I allow to arise these things that are reminders of like, oh, this is why, this is the benefit, this is the fruit of this labor, right? The relief of my suffering and the relief of their suffering. Like I remember feeling free when I would be sitting at my grandmother's feet, right? And she was totally present. I was free from the suffering of my life, the suffering that was happening in my home. That in those moments there was freedom in that quality of presence of being with her. And I think that that's what happens like with my nephews, is that they're not having suffering in like the usual teenage angst they have, but in those moments when they're here and we're present with them, I think that those are moments absent of suffering. And I think that that's born of this, out of this quality of present and mindfulness and awareness.
No, thank you, Michael. What a beautiful insight. I've known you to have that quality of presence, and also to be somebody who could really sit back and kind of look inward to what is happening in this moment for me and explore it. And, you know, we've explored that. So I'm wondering what's here for you right now.
Yeah. I feel this deep warmth in my chest. This sort of this relaxedness of the muscles in my body. And I feel this joy arising in my heart, in my face. And also like this quality of humility, right? Like this quality of humility that is born out of this awareness that what an incredible gift that has been given through these teachings, right? Yeah, how, you know, that just how humbling that is. Yeah.
Right now, I feel a little bit awed by your ability to speak towards what we teach from your own personal experience. And, you know, knowing you, I know how well that serves you. So thank you for putting words to it. Shifting a little bit to the BIPOC community and the teaching you're doing there, what are you experiencing around that?
Yeah. You know, it has been such a personal growth experience for me. You know, I remember the very first, so UW Health started offering, I was the only teacher of color for many, I was their first teacher of color and their only one for many years. And I remember the program starting to really question and ask themselves, like, why do so few people of color come to our classes, and why do they tend to drop out, you know, in high rates, and what is it that we're missing, right? And so the teacher program started really asking itself, like, there was this shift that needed to happen. The shift needed to go from, why are people of color not coming here? And I started asking, why would they want to? Right? Like, what is it that we have to offer? Why would they want to come to one of our classes? Why would they want to come to a class that's, you know, over $500, and is clearly predominantly white. If we have one or two people of color in a class at that time, that was like a big shock, right? And so, we really started asking ourselves, like, why would they want to come? And then we started to explore the possibility of offering an MBSR class just for the BIPOC community. And I remember the very first time that I taught one, like, it really caused me. So I was raised in an all-white community. I was raised to be incredibly acculturated. That I can walk with ease in both worlds. I can walk on the reservation and I can walk off the reservation. I was taught how to I was educated in all white schools while we were the only family of color in my grade school. And so I was very indoctrinated into a white Western framework. So because of that, I have been able to excel in my life, right? Because I learned those lessons really, really clearly. I was, spent 8 years in the Air Force and had a really amazingly successful career in the Air Force. I've really fortunate jobs. I've been able to be promoted. I've been able to grow professionally. But it's because I learned those lessons about how to be in a white world really, really, really well. And so when I entered into my first BIPOC class, there was deep doubt about my right to be there. Because I sometimes can present as quite white. And I remember feelings of, and I know that many of us have these feelings, right? As MBSR teachers, particularly in the beginning of our experience, like, I'm a fraud. Who do I think I am? I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not nearly good enough. I've not practiced long, and all of those things. They all showed up in this context of being a person of color. And I remember the shift and the transformation that occurred for me in that first BIPOC class. And I remember those moments where I felt at home, where there was this easing in my body that was absent when I'm in predominantly white spaces, right? There was this, there was something that happened. And I felt like in the process of teaching that class, I came home to myself, but also had this rich and beautiful opportunity to open MBSR up. We were able to offer it at no cost. The class filled up, registration filled within 2 weeks. And we had a waiting list. So there was a huge interest in it. And we did a focus group at the end of the MBSR class to try, because I wanted to teach MBSR in BIPOC communities, because I had been hearing that MBSR is for white people. That it is culturally incongruent, that it's not accessible for people of color. So I heard a lot of critique about MBSR and what was wrong with it. And I didn't know if that was true. I said, well, I don't know if that's true. And if it is, what about it makes it like that, in a really, really clear kind of way, right? And so I offered straight MBSR. No, I mean, the adaptations were like, some of the poetry was poetry from people of color. There was a little bit of, so there were some, they weren't adaptations, but there was a little bit more openness. And then at the end, we did these focus groups to ask, like, did the class feel culturally congruent? If it did, what elements or what qualities felt culturally congruent? Were there parts of the class that felt culturally inconsistent or incongruent or insensitive? And what about them was? So not just, yes, it was, but what about them was? Like, is the body scan culturally incongruent? And if it is, in what ways? What makes it culturally, like, trying to really understand if there's an element of MBSR that feels culturally incongruent, like, what is it about that element that is, right? So trying not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What was really, really fascinating was there was absolutely not a single person that said MBSR is culturally incongruent. There was not a single element of MBSR that felt culturally insensitive. and in fact, what was really helpful was that what people pointed out was that what helped the most was that it was led by a teacher of color and that it was all people of color in the class. That's what made the difference for them. That's what invited ease into their bodies so that they could actually lay down and do a body scan, right? Or I remember when we did the stress reactivity, stress response, we intentionally invited the exploration during that week when they're filling out the calendar. We intentionally invited them to explore a racially charged incident that happened that week and to explore that specifically. Right. So that was like not necessarily an adaptation, but sort of like a shift in focus. Right. And people talked about like the ability to talk about that, to share what happened without having to explain it, without having to defend it, without having to justify it was really a huge relief to them. Right. So they would share something and there'd be this room full of Black and brown faces that were all nodding their heads. Right. And nobody was asking you, are you sure that's what they meant? Do you think maybe you were being just a little oversensitive? Or do you think you're reading something into it that really didn't happen? You know, all of those things that happen sometimes to BIPOC folks was absent in these classes. And those were the things that really mattered. So I was really, that was really a deep understanding for me about MBSR. And the way that it can be brought into BIPOC communities. We taught I have had the great fortune to develop a teacher training intensive for the UW Health program. And last year we offered a teacher training intensive solely for BIPOC folks. And 9 women of color signed up for it. Black, Southeast Asian, and Latinx women were in this. And our teacher training intensive, they are in a traditional community MBSR class 1 day a week, and then they are in the teacher training intensive 1 day a week. So they're in a 2.5-hour MBSR class, and then later that week a 3-hour teacher training intensive where we explore the class that just happened, and then do teach backs and explore the intentions and the rationales and all of that. 6 of the women were in almost exclusively white classes, and 3 of the women were in a BIPOC class. It was really, really fascinating to watch and listen to the women who were in predominantly white classes talk about their experiences and the kinds of things that were happening to them that as a teacher, I frequently was not aware of when I had BIPOC participants in my predominantly white classes. Right. And really interesting teachings around being on Zoom, right? The kind of microaggressions that were happening when people were put in breakout rooms. When teachers didn't turn off the ability to chat, participants to chat back and forth, the kinds of microaggressions that were happening in the chat rooms where one white participant would be reaching out to a Black participant and just behaving in ways that felt intrusive to the Black person, but all of those kinds of things. Like it was an amazingly rich experience to hear the way that microaggressions and racial violence show up in a mixed race MBSR class, right? And so really has informed for me when I'm teaching MBSR in mixed race classes to really think about like, where's the time? Is there a time? And if there is, when is the time to do small group things or to do dyads or triads? How do I introduce the ability if you want to be in an affinity triad, raise your hand, right? So how do I become more cognizant of the ways that I can create or support an environment that allows people's full selves to show up, right? Yeah. So, so it was really amazing to teach in a BIPOC space, but it's also been really, really powerful to see what I've learned from that when I'm teaching in mixed race spaces. Because it has like I know that Allan and I, when I was doing mentoring with you, we talked about breakout rooms in Zoom and all that. I no longer, when I'm teaching in Zoom, I no longer do breakout rooms.
Oh, that's
Because
interesting. Very interesting.
I don't have a way to control what's happening in there.
Mhm.
And and that same is true for for women. Like, we don't know what kind of aggressions might be happening to women in breakout rooms, right?
It's
Or when we
true.
don't have the chat turned off. Um, yeah,
That's very true. And how would we really know in a classroom either? We have the ability to see body language and walk around maybe and hear a few words here and there, not
yeah,
eavesdropping, but just kind of checking.
yeah, yeah. It's
But
really
we
interesting.
still wouldn't really pick it up, would we?
No,
If yeah, unless it
not
was
not in
reported.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I asked these women who were in the TTI. Right, these were women who had been through MBSR. They were meditators. I asked them, like, what are the things that got in the way? And they all were being the 6 women who were in predominantly white classes. There were three trainees, three participants in each of these classes. So 3 women of color in a predominantly white class, and that happened twice. Um, they were being taught by white teachers, and then the BIPOC class was being taught by a BIPOC person. And I asked the women who were in the white classes, what gets in the way of being able to go to your teacher and say, this is what's happening? And the consistent message was, I don't know if the teacher can handle it. And I
Oh,
don't want to be labeled as that person.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The participant wants to be seen in a certain way by the teacher in a way that's a flattering way, so to speak. And if you rock the boat,
Right.
then that might not occur.
Yeah.
So how do you invite that in then?
Yeah, so what was really interesting was to at the end of the teacher training intensive, our last session, the MBSR teachers are invited to our last session, and we have a dialogue together about what their experience was and what happens. And all of these women were invited to sort of share what their experience was, to allow us as MBSR teachers to hear the experience and to understand it and to try to think about, how do I integrate what they've learned, right? So one of the things that was really interesting that for me, I think has been really helpful, a couple of the women talked about their experience when they in the orientation, MBSR orientation session, and then the first class, to be in a class where a white teacher stands in front of the room and talks about their commitment to social justice, to the elimination of racism, and really talks about their commitment to that. And what was really interesting was that the very next thing that happens is people are invited to a deep reflection about what brings you here, why are you here, what's your deep heart desire for being here, and then puts them into, at that time, breakout rooms, where people of color were partnered with a white person, and this person of color is invited to share deeply, why they're there. And feeling that incongruence between this voiced commitment to social justice, racial justice, the elimination of racism, and then what felt like an insensitivity to being invited to share their deepest heart's desire for why they're there, without really even having a relationship with the person that they're with, right? So I don't do that anymore, right? I invite the reflection, right? And then I invite the letting go of the achieving, right? Of trying to get something. Um, and then ease our way into sort of like this larger group discussion around all of that. So I watch, like, where are the times that I might be setting things up for the potential for harm to maybe happen. I also, I think that this is really a delicate dance. Is, I invite people, like, if things aren't going well, if things are difficult, if things are challenging, if things are happening in class that don't feel good or right to you, please come talk to me about it, right? So I extend the invitation, but then I also watch. And if I see something, I remember a Japanese international student in one of my classes who after a longer practice period got up and left and then never came back for that class, right?
Mhm.
And so I reached out to him and said, just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. I'm curious. I saw that you left. I'm wondering if there's anything you need to talk about or want to talk about. But watching for those moments where, like, oh, I wonder if it would be helpful to reach in, recognizing what it takes for them to reach to us, right? Um, uh, and particularly if it's a person of color needing to reach to a white person, right? Um, so I watch for those moments where there's an opportunity to actually model my commitment to racial justice, social justice, and the elimination of racism. Right?
Mm.
Yeah. And I watch for it in myself. Like I watch for my own internalized oppression. I watch for my own internalized colonialism. I watch for those places and those ways that I behave. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but watching for those places and those ways that I'm behaving in like a white person, right? Um, so because that's incongruent with who I am, right? Um, so yes, so I've learned to start to watch for those things as well, and to have a relaxed body, mind, and heart while I'm doing it, which is the greatest challenge,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. Because my own internal critic shows up regularly. It's like, oh, Michael.
That's one of the most gentle, soft-sounding internal critics I've heard. Congratulations on living with that one.
Yeah, but he has this particular look on his face when he's doing
Uh,
that.
that's that's where he gets you.
Yeah.
Uh, so, what year was that first BIPOC class?
It would have been, I think, 4 or 5 years ago now.
Okay, because I recall this being addressed at UMass conference. I believe maybe the first one in 2010, when people would stand up and talk about, well, the classes are all white or a certain age group and all of that. So coming from there to where you presented this first program and first classes to now, how are you seeing things shifting? You're now training teachers of color who are going to go out. And not only how are they shifting, but I'm a little curious as to, if I can play devil's advocate for a minute, what might be lost in having groups that are made up of one population specifically for that population versus a group that's more mixed, where people are hearing from each other's experience. So
Yeah,
really two questions there.
yeah, it's a really, really great question. So to the question about like what might be missed, um, I think that what gets missed is the real time experience of um, of events, right? I think the real time experience of this older white guy who always comes and sits next to me and always has to tell me about his half black great grandson, right?
Mm.
Or those kinds of things, the real time of that, right? And the invitation then to explore that from a mindfulness perspective, like what's happening in your body right now, what's happening with your emotions, like what's the story that's getting created, what is being added on, what happens if you allow that adding on to gently let go and simply be with how things really are right now, like, right? So that distinction and awareness of where suffering starts to occur. I remember the first time that I approached that, from a racial experience kind of thing, like somebody talking about a racial event, and it's a really tender exploration, because it can sometimes sound like, look like, feel like we're getting blamed for our own suffering as a person of color, right? And so it's a really, really tender, delicate conversation to talk about that sophisticated distinction around the role that thoughts and story play in the creation of our suffering.
Mhm.
So I think that having mixed classes allows for those real-time experiences to start to emerge. I think the other thing that can get lost is the universality of suffering.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That white suffering looks like Black suffering, and it looks like Native suffering, and it looks like Southeast Asian suffering. Like suffering is suffering. The mechanism of suffering is the same, right? It is the actual events that are happening, as if those aren't hard enough and bad enough and difficult enough. It is what gets added on that causes us to suffer. And that process of adding on looks the same if you're white, if you're Black, if you're brown, if you're light brown, right? That can get lost, right?
Yeah.
And the potential for the recognition of our common humanity,
Yeah.
in this acknowledgement that suffering is suffering, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too that, the UW mindfulness program just developed a embodied racial justice class, using what that is, mindfulness based. So there's all meditation in it, but then there's this exploration of embodied racial justice. And so understand in that context. And I think that MBSR has the potential of introducing it when we're not, it's not something that you would talk about, but it would be an embodied experience, that you, Allan, as an older white man, that your liberation is deeply tied to my liberation, and my liberation is deeply linked to your liberation, right? That both of us can only be liberated to the extent that the other is, right? That our liberation is deeply linked to each other. And in an MBSR class, I think that there is the potential for that to be observed and experienced, right?
Yeah.
When you see another participant work with their own suffering, and you feel your suffering start to rise up and open, right? So there's that potential for this linked liberation. And so I think that can get lost in affinity groups. Yeah. I hope that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and it really speaks to a lot of the places we're at now as a society. And when I start to lose a sense of, are we helping? And I don't mean helping in like we're the helpers, but is there benefit within this? As we look out into the world and we play our part. And I think you just spoke towards, where that benefit can lie in influence. And that gives me hope. So it's a profound teaching, I think, what you just said, at least giving me hope.
Yeah. And I think that in an MBSR class, like it's not anything that we make happen.
No.
I think that it has the potential to emerge out of the
Yeah.
teachings and the
Yeah.
experience. Right.
Yeah.
And even participants might not even be able to put a name to that. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which is actually, I think, when it is being learned, when it doesn't need to be named or can't be named, but it's there. Yeah.
Yeah, like my
Yeah.
first experience with being led in a meditation, but by Marsha Linehan, like it
Right.
woke something up in me,
Exactly.
right? I had no words
Yeah.
for it, but it woke something up in me.
Yeah. Exactly. Wow. Are you generally hopeful?
Ooh. Yes, I am. I can easily get lost in despair.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I but I'm able to see that more quickly and more clearly. And I feel like the teachings have given me skillful ways to respond to despair, and to awaken, to tend the soil, for the other things that are also there. Right? It's not just despair. Right? It's despair and hope. Right? Um, it's despair and joy. It's despair and willingness. It's despair and openness. Like it doesn't travel by itself. Right? Yeah, and I think that the teachings have given me that ability to see it's not just this.
It's the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Despair is here and yeah.
I think Allan, that the one of the as we're talking and as I'm thinking about this, I think that that's a part of what's coming out of my work with the reservation
Mm-hmm.
is the development of this longer view, right? Beyond the life of this grant that we have. So a bunch of us, a number of us teachers got together, white and teachers of color, about how to bring mindfulness into our communities or communities of color. And so, so we were awarded a grant through the Katali Foundation, about $1.25 million, to bring mindfulness into our community. So Menominee Reservation, one of our Black teachers is teaching the Black educators and teachers in the Madison School District, and another one is offering mindfulness classes in the immigrant Latinx community here in Dane County. And then the Utah Health Mindfulness Program is funding these BIPOC classes. And I don't know where I just got lost. Isn't that funny when that happens?
Yeah. Wait until you're my age. You
Oh,
laugh a lot.
anyways, it was leading to something really amazing, and now it's gone.
Well, maybe it'll come back.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, that used to happen to me when I was a little kid. My mother would say, "That's because you're getting ready to tell a lie."
Oh.
She was full of wit.
Uh, well, Michael, what else might you want to leave us with in terms of the work or what's happening at UW or anything else you might be involved in?
Yeah. I'm involved in this really, really delightful work with UCSD right now, with training teachers of color, and training trainers of color. So I'm participating in a year-long project with them, where it's training trainers of color who will train MBSR teachers, which is really, really powerful. I'm just loving spending that time. And it's also really pushing me, right, to truly take my seat, right? With sort of like not authority, but with this quality of humility. And I often think of the story about the Buddha's awakening and how Mara was really challenging the Buddha, saying, well, who do you think you are? Right? And the Buddha touched the earth, and the earth bore witness to the Buddha's right to awaken, right? And so I think of that when I find myself like doubting myself, when it's like, who do you think you are, Michael? Like, how did you get so full of yourself? Right? Like, it's like, oh, Mara, there you are again.
Yeah,
right?
that imposter syndrome doesn't go away.
Yeah,
It sneaks back in.
it sure does. It sure does, right? And I envision myself taking my seat and touching the earth and allowing the earth to bear witness, right? And that's sort of like when that happens, like I feel myself sit up, right? I feel my head adjust and the crown of my head rise to the sky, right? Yeah. So that's been really, really beautiful work with them. I've really enjoyed it. They're taking a cohort of people of color from their first MBSR class and escorting them through the entire certification process. Working with the people of color who've taken our teacher training intensive. I'm doing mentoring with them. Now they have the invitation to assist when I teach an MBSR class, and then the next time they're invited to co-teach with me, and they can co-teach a couple of times, and I'm doing mentoring with them during those co-teaching times as well. And just finding myself really, really inspired by these deep commitments to teaching in their communities. But also this really deep commitment to the deepening of their own practice and to the development of their own self-awareness, right? Of like, what's getting in the way? Like, what happened right there when that exchange happened with that participant? What happened to you, right? Yeah. So really finding myself really deeply inspired and humbled, truthfully humbled by, and it's been predominantly women, but humbled by these women of color who want to step into this. Yeah.
And actively kind of being the path on that long view, guiding presence. Yeah, that long view is an interesting place to land. I think it's really an important place to land. And we simply don't know as this unfolds into mystery with what I would say is love.
Yeah.
How it will process through. So it's always that despair and that long view has been a big part of my end.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's been wonderful to have you here today.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I hope many listen to this. The BIPOC work is really another one of those jewels that's emerging in the field, right? Along with trauma-sensitive mindfulness and various ways of looking at our teaching and who are we as teachers and how can we be more inclusive and hold that space safely.
Yeah, as best we can, right? We just don't know what is safe for this person and the next person, right? And when we tell people this is a safe space, we're doing disservice, right? Because we don't know. We don't know what safe is for you and what safe is for me. Right? Yeah. But we can do our best to create a space where people can experiment with showing up as their full self as best they can, moment to moment. Right? Yeah. And including us, including ourselves.
It has to start with us, right? It can't be known in our awareness. If it's not known in our awareness, it can't be held
Mhm.
Yeah. So I absolutely. Well, again, Michael, thank you for your showing up today, your authentic self. And it's always a joy, as always, to be with you. So
Thank you
much
so
gratitude.
much. My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Click down below to join our Mindfulness Teacher Community Network on Facebook, where you are invited to post and share. Also, subscribe to Sing to the Mountain Studio. Ring the bell so you don't miss out on future recordings.